Professor Smith, very well done. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce to you my former professor, Michael Waldman, the Charles H. Dyson Professor of Management and Professor of Economics. As those of you who took a class with Professor Waldman remember his questions on the transfer prices of corn and wheat, may be surprised to hear he is not from the Midwest, but rather New Jersey. It's still unclear to me where his predilection for commodity agriculture-based questions came from, but it is not a result of growing up in the cornfields of Nebraska. He graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a Bachelor's of Science in Economics, which I believe you will hear more about shortly, received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and completed postdoc work at UCLA, where he was hired as an assistant professor and offered tenure. Shortly thereafter, he decided to leave the beaches and sunshine of Southern California for Ithaca's lovely winters, joining Johnson in 1991. Since leaving the distractions of Southern California behind him, Professor Waldman has become both a revered teacher and a highly esteemed researcher. His publications are too numerous to list here, but some of his most interesting work has been on the exploding growth of autism diagnosis rates and whether they can be explained by environmental triggers, such as early childhood television watching. At Cornell, he's held a number of leadership positions, including chair of Johnson's Faculty Policy Committee, director of the Institute for Economic Advancement, and the University Strategic Planning Advisory Committee. However, based on our conversations, he seems proudest of the work he did, ensuring that new chalkboards were installed in all classrooms following the latest renovations. He lives in Ithaca, he's married, he's the loving father of 2 children, and a prodigious consumer of Diet Coke. Professor Waldman.
Thank you, Robert, for this very nice introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. When I got this invitation, well, gee, life lessons, I don't think you want to hear anything about economics. So I thought of it, and I decided to talk about something which I actually never talked about in all my years of teaching. So for those of you who've had a course from me, you know that I sometimes talk about my family. I used to talk about my mother when she was still alive. When I first moved here a lot in the 90s, I talked a lot about my mother in my class. Now I sort of bring out my kids and my wife into lectures. But you know, in all my years of teaching, I've never talked about my father. So today I'm going to talk about my father. And the reason I'm talking about my father is that if I think about life lessons that I've learned, it's clear that I've learned more life lessons from my father and my father's story than from anything else. So that's why I'm going to talk about my father. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly talk to you about my story, which Robert already talked a little bit about. Then I'll talk to you about my father's story, and then I'll talk about what I learned from my father and my father's story. So what's my story? I grew up in New Jersey, as Robert pointed out. We didn't have a lot of money, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And in fact, I'd never been outside of New Jersey or New York City until I went to college. When I was in high school, which was in the mid-1970s, I wanted to be a mathematics professor at a major university like Cornell, and I was lucky enough to get accepted into MIT. So in 1977, I went off to MIT, still thinking I want to be a math professor, and started taking math courses at MIT in my freshman year. And for the first time in my life, I found that there were people, A, who were better than me at math, and B, I was really struggling in one of the courses, the differential equations course, which was a completely new experience for me, and I decided I really didn't like that. And I happened to be taking economics as a distribution requirement. I think it was almost like a humanities or social science distribution requirement. I had no idea what economics was before I got there, but I was happened to be taking it at exactly the same time that I was struggling in this math course. It was the second semester of my freshman year. Being a little bit kind of impulsive and having to focus on something, I said, well, okay, I'll just switch to economics. And that's what I did, and here I'm still doing economics 40 years later. So I graduated with an undergraduate degree in economics from MIT. I moved to the University of Pennsylvania, where I got my PhD. Had an all-star dissertation committee, one Nobel Prize winner, two others who might win Nobel Prizes. I had a great experience at Penn. And then my first job was at UCLA, where I moved there in 1982. Got tenure. And around 1989, visited at the business school at Yale while I was at UCLA. And in 1990, enjoyed teaching MBAs, although I'm not sure they enjoyed my teaching because it was my first time. Then just about a year later, I got an invitation to give a job talk at the Johnson School. It actually came from Professor Frank. I think he was leading the search committee at the time. And I wound up moving to Cornell in 1991, and I've been teaching the core course. And since then, Bob and I have been switching off rotating years since about the year 2000. Okay. Now, what do I do now? Well, I teach, I do research, I travel around the world. And then like I mentioned this before, when I was in high school, I'd literally never been outside of New Jersey, New York City. Now I travel around the world talking about my research. I've been to Australia, Chile, Hong Kong, China, Japan, etc., etc. Just in Switzerland a month ago. And it's very nice. It's a great life. And while I'm doing that, I frequently, people want to take me around and show me the sights. We go out to dinner, and of course, we start talking about family. And I'll mention, sometimes it comes up in the conversation, that my brother actually has a PhD from Harvard in chemistry. And whenever I say that, the natural next question is, oh, were your parents professors? Because, they're basically two children in my family. We both have PhDs from Ivy League institutions. We're both doing quite well. It's natural. That's kind of an unusual family, so that kind of standard would be, well, parents must be professors. Well, that's actually not quite right. My mother was what's called a biller typist, which is a job that doesn't exist anymore, and she had a high school education. My father was a sewing machine operator who had an 8th grade education. One more detail I usually volunteer is my father was a concentration camp survivor. And then the next question I'm always asked is, which camps was he in? And the answer is he was in Auschwitz and Dachau. But that's actually just a very small part of his story. His story is much more interesting, I think, than the fact that he was in those particular camps. So now I'm going to tell you my father's story. My father, when I knew him, his name was Henry Waldman, but actually, when he was born in 1909, his name was Chaim Waldman, and he lived in Ostrowar, Poland, which was a small town outside of Lodz, which is one of the larger cities in Poland. He had 10 brothers and sisters, and actually, other than that, I don't really know too much about his life in Europe because he never talked about it. Now, I did do some investigation through what's called the International Tracing Service to learn a little bit about his life, so let me tell you what I think I learned. Some of this, this is what they told me, and they were pretty confident this is right. So he basically worked as a tailor, before the war. And around the time that the war started, that the Nazis invaded Poland, he was married and he had 2 very young sons. The family was arrested in 1940 and moved into the Lodz ghetto. Then, at some point, they don't know exact year, moved to Auschwitz. And in 1944, he participated in one of the Nazi death marches and was moved to Dachau. He was liberated by the Americans in 1945. And at that point in time, he was the only survivor. His parents, his wife, his 2 children, all his nephews and nieces, as far as I know, none of them have survived. From 1945 to 1949, he was in various hospitals and displaced persons camps. And then in 1949, he was sponsored by a cousin who lived in New Jersey, and he moved to the US. He knew no English at that point, and what he did have was he brought a sewing machine with him. I asked him about that at one point. He said, well, he wasn't sure that in the US there were any sewing machines, and he needed a sewing machine to make a living. So that kind of gives you a sense of how much knowledge he knew about the US when he moved here. He moved into a boarding house in Paterson, New Jersey. He, at that point, was 39 years old. Basically knew no one other than this one cousin. In that boarding house was a 24-year-old woman, and he lied to her. My mother told me this story about 20,000 times. He lied to her and told her that he was 4 years younger than he actually was, and they wound up getting married in 1950, and my brother was born in 1951, and I was born in 1955, and the rest of the story, he worked as a sewing machine operator, and his 2 sons did quite well academically. And he died in 1994, not in the camps, but in a hospital with his wife and youngest son, me, in the room, trying to soothe him. Now, one question you might ask is, what did he think about his own life, what he went through? And the answer is, I don't know, because he never talked about it. At one point, I read something that Steven Spielberg had written about, when the survivors are, before they die off, you should ask them about their life. So at one point I felt guilty because I never talked to my father about that. And so when he was maybe around 80, I happened to be, there was a little bit of a family get-together, and I started talking to him about what his life was like in Europe. We got about 30 seconds of the conversation. Honestly, I don't remember anything that he said in those 30 seconds. And he looked at me with a look on his face different than I'd ever seen in my life. Extremely sad, extremely annoyed. And he said, why are you asking me this? I shut up, and that's the last I ever talked to him about that. Now, he did realize that what he had done was certainly unusual, and the way I know that is that in the mid-1980s, my parents were visiting me when I was a young assistant professor at UCLA, and we were walking around the campus, very pretty campus if you haven't been there, and I was introducing to some of my colleagues, and he said something which kind of out of the blue. He didn't say, Mike, I'm really proud of you, you've done really well. What did he say? He said, are you embarrassed by me? Because he knew that the parents of all my colleagues, or almost all my colleagues, in fact, I have all the colleagues I knew, did not have parents like my father. They didn't have parents who were sewing machine operators, and even more rare, concentration camp survivors. I told him, of course, I'm not ashamed of it, and obviously, given that I'm talking about it here, it's not something I'm ashamed about. And in fact, in a sense, it's something I'm very proud of. So that's my father's story. What did I learn? What do I take away from my father and from my father's story? First, determination, perseverance, grit. Extremely important. My father was very lucky to survive, no doubt about it. My father was a sewing machine operator, was a tailor, would run a sewing machine, and if you go through the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you'll see, you know, the Nazis used the people in the camps to do stuff for them. And one of the things they did was, you know, construct clothes, you know, put together clothes, and so the fact he was a sewing machine operator was one of the reasons he survived. But it's also the case that he had incredible determination. He had incredible determination both to survive the camps. He had incredible determination after he came to the States with, you know, few skills, no English, to get married, raise a family, raise 2 successful children who have done well. Second thing I take away is take risks for a reason. I sometimes see some colleagues take kind of incredible risks, and I ask them why, you know, what's the return? And I get nothing other than, oh, that person kind of annoyed me a little bit. My father, he took very few risks when I was, you know, when I saw it. But he told, you know, I said he spoke very little about his life in Europe. But he told one story. He said, you know, at one point when he was in the camps, he got quite sick. He thought he was going to die. What did he do? He stole a bag of potatoes from the Nazi guards. If he had gotten caught, he clearly would have been killed. He didn't get caught. He ate those potatoes. He got better. He survived. He took a risk. Took a risk for obviously good reason. He was going to die. And that's a good reason to take a risk. Another thing I take away from my interaction with my father was show respect. Show respect to everyone. You know, don't wait to see if the person has a lot of money or education. Everybody deserves respect, at least until they show you a lack of respect. Now let me give you a little story to illustrate that. You know, my father, I thought, in a sense, did an incredible thing, but what he went through. But he was shown very little respect. You know, he spoke with a heavy accent. We didn't have a lot of money. He dressed what I think was stylish for Eastern Europe back, you know, a long time ago. So he didn't look kind of natural. He was extremely argumentative. You know, the deans might think I'm argumentative. You shouldn't, my father. We were walking, this was in the kind of late 1970s. My parents came to visit in Cambridge. Me, my brother, my parents were walking around MIT. And one of the grads, I think it was a grad student, had a box of computer cards where he had his program, and he had dropped it. There were 1,000 computer cards scattered on the lawn. We had nothing to do with that. We didn't do that. But you know, this guy sort of thought this was a catastrophe, the worst thing that ever happened in his life, and was pleading with everyone walking by to help him pick up the cards. Now, honestly, if I was walking by myself, I would help him pick up the cards, because that's what I do. My father, that's not what he does. And so we were walking by, and I started to try to help, and my father said no. It's like, okay. So we kept walking. The fellow got very upset. And the fellow started yelling at us, "You're no better than Nazis." My father just kept walking. I got so upset, I didn't yell at him. I walked back to him and I said, "Do you realize you just called an Auschwitz survivor who lost his whole family, you just called him as no better than Nazis because he wouldn't help you pick up your computer cards. You should be ashamed of yourself. This student was not showing respect because, well, first of all, he was upset, but also he looked at my father, and my father did not look to him like someone who deserved respect. That always bothered me. I try to show respect to everyone. Doesn't matter religion, race, education, income. I try to show respect to everyone. Another thing I learned from my father is family support. He lost his whole family. And it was clear, it was a difficult father, which is, I think, kind of standard for people who went through that experience. But it was clear to him that he valued his family in the United States extremely. It was extremely important to him. Remember, value your family. The last thing I learned from my father was something he would tell me repeatedly when I was small. My mother would say, get good grades. I had other relatives who were very focused on money. My father, he never said anything about grades, never said anything about money. He never, he didn't care if I did well in sports. And if I did badly, he would say something nasty to me. But if I did something he liked, he would say, "You're a real mensch." What's mensch? Well, mensch is a Yiddish term taken from German that says a person with integrity and honor. And what I try to do in my life is sort of, honor my father by trying to be a mensch. Thank you very much.